Bill, welcome. It's always very good to have you here at VOA. I want to talk about happy things and sad things today, and let's start with cheerful or semi-cheerful things. You've been working all these years on Magnitsky Act, and now the whole initiative is turning into global Magnitsky Act. Yeah. Are you fully satisfied?
Well, I'm not satisfied at all because we're just in the middle of the process. So in December of 2012, after about 3 years of hard work and a lot of lobbying in Washington, the Magnitsky Act was passed, which sanctions the killers of Sergei Magnitsky and other gross human rights abusers in Russia, which has been an excellent accomplishment. It's not been implemented properly by the United States government. There's only 32 people on the Magnitsky list more than 2 years after the law was passed, and so there's a lot of work that needs to be done in implementing that. But the really good thing is that the congressmen and the senators who sponsored the Magnitsky Act realized that this was something much bigger than one case of Magnitsky or even one country. And in January of this year, Senators Cardin and McCain and Chris Smith and Jim McGovern in the House launched the Global Magnitsky Act, which would impose visa sanctions and asset freezes on human rights violators anywhere in the world, whether it be China or Uzbekistan or Venezuela. And what this means for me as Sergei Magnitsky's advocate is that his name is going to be on a law, hopefully when it passes, which will create consequences for human rights abuses everywhere. And one of my biggest concerns after he was murdered was that his death would be a meaningless death, and we can never bring him back, but what we can do is say that he has a legacy that's going to live on forever through his name and through his suffering that led to this enormous change in world policy.
And I understand there is some action in Canada now with regards to that.
So I just returned from Ottawa several weeks ago, and I met with the foreign minister and the immigration minister, as well as various members of parliament. And there's been a unanimous resolution in the Canadian Parliament calling on the government to impose a Magnitsky Act there. And it's been indicated to me by the ministers and by all different parties in the parliament that they are now actively working on, from a government perspective, on putting this into place. And so I'd be surprised if there wasn't something in place in Canada in the near future.
And you have a very busy travel schedule. I understand that you're traveling and pretty much raising awareness of your initiative, of Magnitsky case, and many other things that are related to that. Do you feel that in these 4 years, it's been somehow people know more? They've recognized the name here, and who is more kind of aware?
Well, the answer is that I've been all over the United States and all over the world in the last 2 months. My book, Red Notice, has been published in I think 10 countries so far. I think there's about 22 countries ultimately that are going to translate it and publish it. The book tells Magnitsky's story and my story, and it tells it in a very approachable way in which somebody who's not necessarily interested in Russia or international relations can read it, because it reads like a spy thriller, which it pretty much is. Unfortunately, it's all true. So I've been all over the world telling the story. Now, what I've learned is that, yes, people know about Magnitsky's name in Washington because of the Magnitsky Act, and on Wall Street, many people know the story because people followed the fate of my hedge fund, Hermitage fund. But the average person in America doesn't know the name Magnitsky and probably doesn't even know where Russia is. However, I'm intending to change that, and the way you change it is through Hollywood. And what's the next step in the process of having written this book is to have it adapted into a Hollywood feature film, and I'm in discussions now with a number of big filmmakers in Hollywood to make that transition. And if you get a Hollywood movie made, then the average person in Missouri or Massachusetts will have known the name Magnitsky and will know that the criminality of the Putin regime.
You started talking about the book, and when the book was released, you and me talked, and we were discussing the possibility of this book being translated into Russian and being available for Russian-speaking readers. Now the book is in Russian. do you expect that it's gonna become available and maybe popular in Russia?
The book is now translated into Russian. It was not published by a Russian publisher. There was not a Russian publisher in Russia who would touch it. However, there was a lot of people in Ukraine, a lot of publishers in Ukraine that were interested, and so we have a Ukrainian publisher who's published the book. It's available on Amazon, on iTunes, and on Google Play. It's also available in a book format from Ukraine, and this book will eventually find it certainly will find its way into the hands of Russian speakers outside of Russia, and I can't imagine that once it finds its way into Russia that it won't be purchased and shared among people in Russia. It tells a different story than the story that Putin wants to tell. He wants to talk about himself being a nationalist. What this book says is that Putin is not a nationalist, but he's a criminal. He's a criminal stealing from the Russian people. The Magnitsky story, one of the reasons that Putin is so sensitive to the Magnitsky story and so angry about it is that it proves that Putin doesn't care about the Russian people. He cares about enriching himself and all of the people in the police structures and secret service structures around him.
At some point, you had problems with being pursued by the Russian side. At some point, they were trying to put you on the Interpol list. How is the situation now with that?
Well, they have, I would estimate somewhere between 50 and 100 people working inside of the Russian law enforcement authorities who are working on the Bill Browder case in all different parts of it. They would like to bring me back to Russia, either legally through extradition or through Interpol, or illegally through rendition, so that they could then basically do the same thing to me that they did to Sergei Magnitsky, torture and kill me in custody.
And you were invited at some point to Russia to testify, and you never went.
And so at this point now, they're inviting me not to testify, but to serve 9 years in prison, which I was sentenced for in a trumped-up case where I was Sergei Magnitsky's co-defendant in the first ever posthumous trial in the history of Russia.
Well, I'm very glad that you're here. Here in Washington, you'll be talking not just about Sergei Magnitsky this time, but also about Boris Nemtsov, who was a very active proponent of Magnitsky law and Magnitsky initiative. And now, sadly, there is a discussion of Nemtsov list as well. What is your reaction and assessment, and what message was sent by his death?
Well, I knew Boris well. Anybody who was doing good work opposing the Putin regime knew him well. He was a hero of the opposition movement. Boris Nemtsov was a man who could have sold out the way all these other Russian officials sold out and became corrupt. He was a deputy prime minister in charge of the oil industry. He could have easily gone the same way as Shuvalov or any of these characters. But instead, he chose a path of righteousness and a path of what was good for Russia. And he went into the opposition at great personal cost. And he became the champion of all good causes, including the Magnitsky cause. And he was here in Washington, he was in Brussels, he was in London, he was in various places arguing in favor of a Magnitsky list, Magnitsky sanctions. He even stood out and demonstrated in Moscow in one-man demonstrations in favor of Magnitsky sanctions. And as we know, on the 27th of February, he was gunned down in front of the Kremlin. And the purpose of killing him was to send a message of terror to every single other member of the opposition, that the man who was most beloved, who was most well-known member of the opposition could be killed right in front of the Kremlin. The message was clear that there's no longer the risk of going to jail as a member of the opposition. There's a risk that you'll die. And I can't imagine that anybody who is a member of the Russian opposition right now feels anything other than raw terror and feels like their life is limited because of that. And I think that will seriously damage the enthusiasm and the self-confidence of the opposition, because that's what terror is supposed to do.
what are you going to say when you're testifying on Boris Nemtsov's assassination on the Hill?
Well, my message is very clear that in order to properly get to the truth of this matter, there needs to, the people who are most likely to be the culprits, Putin and his secret police, can't be in charge of the investigation, and there needs to be a proper international investigation into his murder, because until then, we can only assume that it was Putin who orchestrated it.
So, Bill, we are talking about Russian opposition, and we have now the case of Natalia Pilavina, who was a very prominent activist in the Magnitsky effort, and she was lobbying for the initiative here in Washington, in London, I know, and then in Moscow.
Well, first of all, Natalia Pilavina was one of our biggest allies. She was an incredibly strong and brave activist. She was extremely outspoken and effective in rallying civil society about the Magnitsky murder and fighting for Magnitsky sanctions. And she was also very outspoken about the crimes of the Putin regime. And what they always do to people like this is they put them in jail. And I've many times spoken to Natalia and said, please don't go back to Russia. And she says, I can't not. Russia is my country, and Russia and what they're doing in my country needs to be exposed and fought. And so there she is, she's back, and what they've done is they've opened up a criminal case against her. They raided her home, seized all of her computers, seized all of her documents, and we know how these criminal cases develop. They will put her eventually on trial, and they'll put her in jail. And that's really a terrible thing, and I can only hope that this is one of the few instances where that doesn't happen, because she's just going to become another victim, another hostage to the Putin regime.
When you talked about Natalia Pilavina and opposition, Russian opposition in general, that the mood is grim and bad, do you feel that opposition activity in Russia is not going to be efficient for a while? Do you feel that being outside for Russian activists is more efficient, and they can be more vocal, and they can spread their message more in a better way?
Well, every opposition person I know feels like they have to be in Russia to be honest with their opposition, and I don't believe that I believe that a properly articulate opposition person is more effective being able to speak than being hushed up in jail. And it's obvious, they're just arresting everybody. Anybody who's effective, they will arrest. There's no question about it. From every different group, it's from all different parts of the opposition. And so I encourage everybody to go into exile and to speak from exile, as opposed to being a martyr and being a hostage, because being a hostage doesn't achieve anything.
You've been in politics for this last years, but you're a businessman. You're good at the questions of business and economy. Now with the sanctions that Russia is facing, and I know you encouraged many times not to invest in Russia because it's just not going to work. How do you feel the investment climate is changing? Are you changing your predictions in any way?
Well, I would say at this point that even the most oblivious and optimistic person about Russia understands that nothing good is going to happen in Russia. I mean, Russia is effectively closing itself to Western investment and capital, and maybe even closing itself to Russian investment and capital. It's not a place where anyone can go there and have any kind of predictability about what's going to happen in the future. The sanctions are going to hit hard. They're hitting hard. I would guess that between 1.5 and 2 years, the Russian government will effectively run out of money. All their reserves will be burned up. I think you'll see a lot of bankruptcies in Russia, unless one of two things happens: if the oil price goes up, or if the sanctions get lifted. Nobody knows what's going to happen to the oil price, but I think that Putin can't behave in a way that's going to ultimately lead to lifting of sanctions, because the war in Ukraine he's personally invested in this war in Ukraine. He's personally invested in carrying on destabilizing the region. And if he stops that, people will then question, why did you start it in the first place? And so he has to carry on. If he carries on, he ends up with the sanctions. If he ends up with the sanctions, then the economy continues to go down. Now, the consequence of this whole thing is that as the economy goes down, he only has one way of staying in power, which is to keep stirring up this pot of nationalism, to keep on making this all of the West into his enemy, and that's what he's doing, and that's what he'll continue to do.
And let's talk about Ukraine a little bit. And Ukrainian economy is not in its best shape, obviously, and there are reforms, but there should be more reforms, they're saying, and IMF is just putting certain requirements to their aid. What do you expect is going to happen in Ukraine economically?
Well, Ukraine is in a terrible, terrible place. They're in an existential crisis. You know, Russia may try to make it a country that doesn't exist, and so it's impossible for anyone to make any long-term plans, business-wise, investment-wise, foreign capital-wise. And so, as long as Putin is sort of lining up 50 or 100,000 troops at the border of Ukraine, and as long as these parts of Ukraine have been taken, it's going to be impossible for Ukraine to have a good economy. I think that you know, we're in a situation where he's going to slowly grind down Ukraine into a much more serious crisis than they're in today, not just militarily but economically, because that's his intention. He doesn't have to win a war. He just has to destroy Ukraine so it's not a sort of functioning state as a model of what could be versus what Russia is.
And obviously, you being in London, you have a sense of how this relationship between Europe and Russia is unfolding, and it's slightly different from what sometimes the United States expect, and European moods are different, even not just the European Union as a whole, but each individual country. What trajectory do you think is this European policy going to take in terms of Russia and how it's going to be handled?
Well, Europe is not one voice, but 28 voices. Mm-hmm. And what Putin has realized is that he doesn't have to change the mind of Merkel or Hollande or Cameron. He can pick a country off on the edges, and so he's been trying to do this with Greece recently, where Greece is in a near bankruptcy situation, and they've gone to Russia asking for money, and the quid pro quo for that money is that Greece votes against sanctions. Greece doesn't support the EU in any of these anti-Putin efforts, and Putin's really good at that. And if he doesn't get Greece, he'll get Hungary. If he doesn't get Hungary, he'll get Slovakia. If he doesn't get Slovakia, maybe he gets the Czech Republic. And he's looking to play all these individual countries off against the EU. And with 28 countries, he's got a lot of choices. And the EU is structured in such a way that all it takes is one or two vetoers, mm-hmm. and Putin has effectively stymied the whole European Union.
And what about London? What about the UK?
Well, the UK is a country that has typically welcomed criminal money from Russia. If you walk down the street in Belgravia and Knightsbridge, which are the two fanciest neighborhoods, many of the houses and apartments are owned by Russians. You hear Russian being spoken mm-hmm. on the street. And for a long time, they not only tolerated it, they encouraged these Russians coming. Now there's sort of a slightly different tone, but not a completely different tone. And there's an election coming up very, very soon in the UK, and it's completely up in the air whether if the government changes from Conservative mm-hmm. to Labour, whether the Labour government will be more welcoming or less welcoming. It's really hard to say, but the one thing I can say is that the UK has been a haven for criminal Russian money up until now.
So in other words, it's difficult in reality to get unhooked from this Russian money.
Well, every head of state is always worried about their economy. They allowed the Russians to come in, which supported the economy, and so nobody wants to do anything that might hurt the economy. With the exception of Germany, Angela Merkel has taken a principled position on Russia, which has hurt the German economy. But she's done it because she understands that the short-term pain is going to be a lot less than the long-term pain if she doesn't do anything.
With your activities, Bill, you are you've proven to be very efficient with the Magnitsky Act. Are you going to continue? Do you have anything else in mind on the horizon that you can talk about?
Well, the main, we're not done. We still have to get the Magnitsky Act implemented in Europe, which has been a harder process than it was in America. We're working on global Magnitsky in America and potentially the rest of the world as well. And we're also assisting different governments in their own investigations into the money laundering that the money laundering that Sergei Magnitsky was killed over. We're trying to assist different law enforcement agencies and seize that money so that the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky can enjoy the fruits of their crime.